Oh, and final speaker for the early morning panel is Arsalan Khan. Thank you, Arsalan.
Hi, thank you, Niti, for inviting me, and thank you for all these wonderful papers. My paper is part of a larger project on the Tablighi Jamaat and the way in which Tablighi practices of preaching, Dawat, are reconfiguring subjectivity, Muslim subjectivity in Pakistan, Muslim sociality, and even rethinking ideas about sovereignty. So I'm going to speak today about a part of that project that is about the response of Tablighis to the rise of really acerbic and really aggressive blasphemy politics in Pakistan. Pakistani Tablighis, practitioners of the transnational Islamic piety movement, the Tablighi Jamaat, can be seen traveling through Pakistan's villages, towns, and cities in groups of 10 or 12 men, dressed in shalwar kameez, their shalwars raised above the ankles, wearing the Muslim topi and bearing long flowing beards, an image that is immediately discernible as an iconic representation of the Prophet. Tablighis are committed to a distinct form of face-to-face preaching, dawat, that they see as a duty of all Muslims and necessary basis for the spread of Islamic virtue. Towards this end, Tablighis travel for specified periods of time from mosque to mosque and house to house, inviting, the literal meaning of the word dawat, fellow Muslims to the mosque to pray and listen to sermons with the ultimate aim of getting them to commit to dawat. Tablighis insist that their method of preaching, tariqa-e-tabligh, follows the Prophet's way and therefore, like all the Prophet's actions, is divinely inspired. This commitment to their own form of dawat places Tablighis at odds and sometimes even in conflict with a range of Islamic actors, from Islamist political parties to corporations to NGOs, that all claim to be advancing the cause of Islam in Pakistan. And while there's some tension, there's also some overlap, and we can talk about that later. Tablighis, however, insist that many of these activities conflate religion, deen, and the world, and therefore fail to spread virtue. In this paper, I explore how the piety framework of the Tablighi Jamaat that rests on a sharp distinction between religion and the world shapes the Tablighi response to the growing politicization of blasphemy in Pakistan. Tablighis, like other Islamic groups, regard blasphemy to be a grave sin and a form of moral injury that must be addressed. But unlike many Islamic movements, political parties in Pakistan, they have not zealously pursued the project of punishing blasphemers. I argue here that the Tablighi commitment to reproducing the conditions for the flourishing of Dawat redirects and even mitigates the violence of blasphemy accusations located at the intersection of Islam and popular sovereignty in Pakistan. Pakistan was conceived as a homeland for Muslims of the Indian subcontinent. Pakistan was founded on the two nation theory that posited that Hindus and Muslims of the Indian subcontinent were fundamentally distinct people with distinct religious and cultural traditions. Despite some of the ostensibly secular dispositions of Pakistan's founding father, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Islam remains central to conceptions of national identity from Pakistan's inception. In 1949, less than 2 years from Pakistan's founding, the Constituent Assembly passed the Objectives Resolution, which declared sovereignty belongs to Allah alone, but He has delegated it to the state of Pakistan through its people for being exercised within the limits prescribed by Him as a sacred trust. End quote. Pakistan then has always wrestled with an internal tension between, on the one hand, the idea that Pakistan should be governed according to a divine plan, and on the other, that it should be dictated solely by the will of the people. All governments have had to strike some balance, and of course, ideally, it was understood that both the will of the people and the will of God would be one and the same somehow, bring these things into a relationship. Islamist political parties like the Jamaat Islami have long argued that Pakistan must move in the direction of Islamic ideals and that this required the creation of an Islamic state. But their abilities to realize this goal remained limited in the first decades after independence. It was the military dictatorship of General Ziaul Haq from 1977 to 1988 that formalized and intensified the link between Islam and the state, making Islam the basis for state sovereignty. The cataclysmic civil war of 1971 that led to the violent rebirth of independent Bangladesh had rent asunder the myth of a united Muslim identity. When Zia assumed power, he claimed it was in defense of both Islam and Pakistan, and he used Islam as a bulwark against both progressive forces as well as ethnic nationalists. Zia's Islamization expanded the scope of Islamic law in Pakistan, establishing the federal scheduled courts to ensure that laws are in keeping with Islam, passed a range of anti-women and anti-minority legislation, mandated the teaching of Islam in schools, and generally promoted Islamic institutions. Islamization expanded the political space for Islamic actors like Islamist political parties and also led to the politicization of the ulama, or greater politicization, I would add, who became increasingly involved in matters of the state. One of the most significant changes brought under Zia's Islamization was the expansion of Pakistan's anti-blasphemy laws. The Indian Penal Code of 1860 introduced laws protecting places of worship and sacred objects from damage and defilement, religious assemblies from disturbance, funeral remains and burial sites from malicious trespass, and religious feelings of any person from deliberate insult. Zia sought to bolster his Islamic credentials by expanding the laws to explicitly protect Islamic symbols and sentiments, including Section 295B against defiling the Quran and Section 295C, which prescribes death for defilement of the sacred personage of the Prophet. The passing of these laws have undeniably created a surge of anti-blasphemy cases, many of which have led to mob violence. And while Muslims make up the majority of the accused, religious and sectarian minorities are disproportionately affected by these laws. So the politics of Islamic sovereignty. My research overlapped with a surge of local and global interest in Pakistan's notorious blasphemy laws. The surge of interest had been brewing because of the well-publicized case of Asiya Masih, a Christian mother of five who had been accused of blasphemy in a small Punjabi village. The accusers claimed that she uttered blasphemous words about the Prophet, but reports suggest that the tensions were sparked when Asiya Bibi Masih drank water from a public well using the same utensils that were used by Muslims, which outraged the caste sensibilities of the latter. In a case that took on global significance as evidence for the absence of religious freedom in Pakistan, Asiya Masih was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging in November 2010. On January 4th, 2011, less than a year into my research, Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab province and a well-known liberal politician, was assassinated by a guard of his own security detail for publicly defending Asiya. The murderer, Mumtaz Qadri, was hailed as a hero by many Pakistanis, and Islamist parties brought out rallies in his defense. In one such rally that I attended, an Islamist activist explained to me that the law itself was sacred. No human being, he insisted, has the power to amend these laws, a point that draws together a range of political Islamist groups across denominations and even sectarian divides. So a range of Sunni groups, Deobandi, Brelvi, and even many Shias agree on this point. Okay? In such a scenario, to call them black law, which, as Taseer had said, they insisted was itself an act of blasphemy. I spent time among liberal secular activists trying to challenge the blasphemy laws, as well as Tabligis, whose position was one of Islamically guided reform. Liberal activists overwhelmingly wanted to repeal the blasphemy laws, seeing them as intrinsically prone to being weaponized against minorities as well as Muslims. But many also recognized that repeal was not necessarily possible in the current political climate. Many therefore accepted that what was needed was to reform the laws to eliminate those aspects of the law that lent them most readily to abuse. There were a range of positions on this that we can talk about. Significant in this is the fact that blasphemy laws, unlike many other criminal laws, have no place for recognizing or probing even the intention of the accused. Because of this feature, the Blasphemous Act can never be repeated in court of law, and this makes it impossible to determine what was said and what the context was of its utterance. This necessarily means that people's guilt can be determined less by any evidence and more by the identity of the accused, which allows them to be wielded readily against religious minorities, both Muslim and non-Muslim, sort of who are seen as intrinsically suspect on this matter. The blasphemy laws also carry extreme punishments, from imprisonment ranging from a minimum of 2 years to life sentence, and 295C, the law against defiling the personage of the Prophet, carries the death penalty. The Tabligis I spoke with were also concerned about the rise of blasphemy accusations. They believed blasphemy accusations were tearing Muslims apart along sectarian lines and also directly hurting non-Muslims, thereby undermining the status of Islam in the world. They were certainly not stridently opposed to the regulation of blasphemy, but they were open to the notion that the laws can be reformed. This is because Pakistani state law, they claim, was worldly and humanly authored and thus subject to change, a position quite different from the one that I heard at the politically charged rallies in defense of the blasphemy laws, the anti-blasphemy laws, I should call them. Many believe this change should be guided by those who were most knowledgeable about divine law, the ulama, and this would indeed bring the most well-being. But on a few occasions, I was able to get my Tablighi interlocutors to a place where they could see the kinds of perspectives that liberal secular activists, at least the more cautious variety, were trying to put forward. Here I argue that the sharp boundary Tablighis draw between religion and the world that frames Dawat as a religious practice also serves a reflexive function that holds at bay the sacralization of the state and law that is so central to blasphemy politics in Pakistan. The ethical affordances of Islamic piety. In his ethnographic and historical work on blasphemy in Pakistan, Asad Ali Ahmed shows that blasphemy laws are themselves constitutive of the very moral outrage that they are designed to regulate. Historically, Ahmed shows that the blasphemy laws were designed under British colonialism as a means for regulating what were presumed to be uncontrollable religious passions between religious communities and therefore understood as preserving intercommunal harmony in a context of growing religious conflict. However, as Ahmed shows, in Pakistan, the laws themselves became entangled in disputes between rival communities. Historically, he shows this is also true for the colonial context. The blasphemy laws depend on evidence that quote unquote religious sentiments have been hurt, and thus the degree of moral outrage generated by the affront itself becomes the basis for restitution and punishment. In this sense, Ahmed argues the laws constitute, quote, a structure of incitement and regulation. The laws simultaneously incite the religious passions that they claim to regulate and regulate those religious passions. The law then becomes a basis for escalation of intercommunal rivalries because the legal basis for punishment is itself invoked as a duty of sovereign authority. Vigilantism also follows when the state or the actors within the state are seen as failing to act in accordance with the law. Indeed, this is precisely how Salman Taseer's murderer Mumtaz Qadri was transformed into a heroic martyr, a shaheed for Islam, whose love for the Prophet compelled him to act when the state failed to fulfill its duties. The sacralization of the law and the extension of state sovereignty is presupposed in the very act of violence. It then is not surprising that blasphemy accusations have surged in Pakistan since the enactment. Liberal secular activists involved in challenging these laws widely recognize the constitutive or at least legitimating role of the law in blasphemy accusations, and much of liberal argument about dismantling these laws presumes that the law creates the conditions for the violence of blasphemy accusations. But the question remains, and this is something I'm interested in, is why do some Islamic groups take up the charge of blasphemy with such eagerness, while for others it remains a moral injury, but not one that they believe should result in violence? This is a particularly important question in Pakistan, which has been besieged by radical forms of Sunni Islam for decades, and the sectarianization of political life has been a great source of anguish for religious minorities, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. This calls for examining the specific forms of ethical reflexivity that facilitate and mitigate against the violence of blasphemy accusations. I argue below that Dawat as a mode of ethical reflexivity does manage and mitigate the potential violence of blasphemy as moral injury, even though it does not transcend or transform the conditions under which anti-blasphemy violence unfolds. For that, of course, we need a more radical appeal and a transformation of existing laws and a rethinking of sovereignty and so on. Nevertheless, understanding the uptake of blasphemy grants us insight into the competing conceptions of Islamic authority in Pakistan. Let me turn to some ethnographic examples. I was with a congregation of Tablighis in a suburb just south of Multan, a region known as a hotbed for sectarian violence in Pakistan. A young man of about 20 years of age from the local Jamaat named Ahmed was accompanying us as a guide to the area. The suburb was mostly poor and dilapidated, and most residents were working class or at the lower end of middle class status who worked in outlying farms or traveled to the city to work as laborers or were small traders, and if educated, did low-level clerical work. As we walked through the area, an eager Ahmed told us about an ongoing conflict in a local mosque. He explained that the imam of the mosque, a Brailwi, was trying to stop Tablighis from holding their daily reading sessions. The Tablighis were trying to reason with him, but in a fit of rage, the Imam had grabbed the Fazail Amal and flung it across the room. A few of the Tablighis had become enraged and had beaten the Imam for what they regarded as an act of blasphemy, given that the Fazail Amal carries the name of the Prophet. Fellow Tabligis had subdued the outraged ones. The Imam was not seriously injured. He threatened to involve the authorities, but was convinced by the others that it could be handled without escalation. Tensions had been brewing in the community for weeks before this. According to Ahmed, the Jamaat then decided this matter through mashwara, through consultation. It was agreed that the matter should be resolved because divisiveness in the community would undermine the prospects of Dawah in the area. The decision was taken to acquire alternative accommodations for the daily readings, giving the mosque over to the Qurayshi segment of the community. It was clear that Ahmed recounted this story in order to seek our advice that he saw as a more that he saw us as a congregation from a higher plane of authority, closer to proximity to the Tablighi elders in the city. The issue was brought up again later in the evening during the formal consultation with both the itinerant and local congregation. The Tablighis in the itinerant congregation confirmed that the decision was correct, as nothing is worse for Dawat than such communal tensions, since they, quote, make the heart hard, and thus Dawat becomes less efficacious. So sectarian boundaries make the heart hard and do not allow Islam to then settle in the heart. In such conversations, the solidifying of communal boundaries was discussed as a metaphor of the hardening of hearts. Such boundaries then became blockages in the path of the sacred word, leading Muslims away from realizing the virtues of Islam. The Tablighi goal of creating a transcendental Islamic community then requires that such conflicts be de-escalated, not always, but sometimes, hearts be softened and the path of the sacred word be cleared for circulation. Tablighis insisted that what is paramount in circumstances of moral injury is punishment of the affront, uh, 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 not punishment of the affront necessarily, but the need to recreate the conditions for dawah, and such conditions require soft hearts and amicable relations between Muslims. The conflict within the mosque remained within the boundaries of an intra-communal conflict, and it makes sense that the hardening of such sectarian boundaries between Sunnis should be seen as an undermining the conditions for dawah, since Sunnis remain the primary target of dawah. But what about cases in which the accused is not seen as being in the boundaries of the larger moral community of Sunni Islam? Since they are the target of Islam, since they are not the target of Islam, does this mean such lives can be dispensed with? Let me briefly turn to a conversation I had with about the assassination of Salman Taseer um, with a local Tablighi in Karachi. Why did he not go through the proper Islamic channels? Someone asked me when I raised the brutal murder of the governor. He should have consulted the ulama on this right. Instead, he made a public statement about the law being a black law. This created outrage. I explained to someone that Asya Bibi was convicted through a law that had some deep flaws. Specifically, I explained the point about intentionality of the speaker. I said there was not enough evidence, so on and so forth. I explained some aspects of the case. So I said such a law is rife for abuse. Someone conceded the point. Arsalan, taking law into your own hands is absolutely not acceptable in any case, but here you are right that such laws should be changed if they are being abused. They must be brought in line with the Sharia, and the ulama should play a part in making sure that they are not abused. While the Multan congregation concluded that the conditions for Dawat would be undermined through the hardening of sectarian boundaries, for Samad, on the other hand, it was the gap between the current instantiation of the Islamic State and the future ideal that came to be the focus of ethical reflection. The idealized state of Islam depends on the formation of a moral community, and since that had not come to pass, there is considerable space for reformulating the law of the state, which is not divine and fixed, but a project that can be changed in keeping with the needs of the time and according to the wisdom of Islamic authority. The state law is not isomorphic, in other words, with divine law here. Crucially, this position retains the notion that blasphemy is a moral injury, but it stresses how the goal is not the punishment in the here and now, but to work for a future in which no acts of blasphemy occur. Someone's position was significantly different from the Islamist political parties and groups that have organized their politics around the creation of Islamic law and state. The politics of moral outrage for Islamists depends on collapsing the gap between divine and state law, insisting that the sacred then and there exists in the Islamic state as it exists in the here and now. It is the temporal collapse then that undergirds the Islamist insistence that Tasia's statement about the laws is itself a blasphemous act. But for many Tabligis, such a temporal collapse between the immanent and transcendent Human and divine, state law and sacred law would be tantamount to usurping divine power. For Samad, the temporal gap between the sacred then and there and the here and now created the potential for a different ethical stance on the problem of moral injury, one that emphasized the conceptualization of the Islamic state as an aspirational form and a process of becoming, a state of the future that only Dawat could gradually make a reality. One can see in both of these examples that the blasphemy remains a moral injury, but different Islamic groups respond to moral injury requires consideration, how they respond. The temporality of piety pushes the ideal Islamic society to the future and becomes the basis for a reflexive ethical stance that keeps in abeyance the conflict that ensues from blasphemy accusations. The escalation of conflict, by contrast, depends on creating an identity between, on the one hand, the here and now and the sacred there and there, then, which collapses the difference between the law of the Pakistani state and the sacred law. For this Islamic future to be realized, it is imperative for the Tabligis that the conditions of Dawat be reproduced, and this requires keeping sectarian and religious boundaries from hardening. Okay. Um, the ethical reflectivity created in Dawat can mitigate the possibilities for sectarian violence, um, as, as well as attacks increasingly common against religious minorities. This violent potential, I suggest, inheres in the notion of as blasphemy as moral injury, but violence is not inevitable response to this perceived moral injury. Indeed, the question of why blasphemy is taken up with such zeal by some Islamic groups must be addressed for a full understanding. I want to say one last thing here. Pakistani state sovereignty rests on its claim to represent and protect Islam, and the blasphemy laws embody this sovereign power. As the Gamban has famously argued, sovereignty involves the power to posit certain types of people as those who can be killed with impunity, at the same time that it defines the moral terms of the polity. Blasphemy laws serve to sacralize Pakistan as an Islamic nation, delineate the proper parameters of Islamic subject, and define those who violate its sanctity as worthy of death. Popular politics around the blasphemy law appropriates this sovereign power to itself in order to create and reinforce social and political hierarchies. As we see clearly in the case of Asia Masih, these are religio caste hierarchies at the heart of Pakistan's national imaginary. Examining the causes of this form of violence is an ethnographic task beyond the scope of the current talk, but it is violence located at the intersection of state sovereignty and popular politics. Thank you.
Thank you, Arsalan.